There are people who begin to see life differently, not all at once, not with thunder or revelation, but slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape they've walked their entire lives in darkness, and suddenly everything familiar becomes strange, everything certain becomes questionable, everything safe becomes uncertain. This awakening, this gradual opening of inner eyes, seems like the beginning of freedom. And perhaps it is. But what most people don't tell you, what gets whispered only in the quiet moments between spiritual teachers and their struggling students, is this. Awakening is not just an opening. It is also a kind of danger, a series of traps laid out precisely for those who begin to see. Thomas Merton knew this. He spent decades in silence, watching his own mind, observing the patterns that ensnare even the most sincere seekers. And what he discovered were not demons or external forces, but territories of consciousness itself, mental places, dangerous ones. Places that destroy not through violence, but through subtle distortion, through the quiet violence of our own misunderstanding. The first place is one almost everyone enters immediately upon awakening. It looks like clarity, but it's actually something far more treacherous. It's the place of spiritual superiority. The moment you begin to see what others don't see, there's a rush, a kind of intoxication. You notice how people chase things that don't matter, how they argue about trivial concerns, how they live on the surface of life, never diving deeper, never questioning the frameworks they inherited. And you've started to question everything. You've begun to see through the illusions, the advertising, the social conditioning, the endless pursuit of validation and comfort. You see it all so clearly now, and in that clarity something dangerous happens. You begin to separate yourself, not physically perhaps, but internally. You create a division, those who see and those who don't, the awakened and the sleeping, and you, of course, are among the awakened. This feels true, it even feels humble in a way, because you're not boasting, you're simply observing reality. But Merton understood something crucial. The moment you position yourself as superior in awareness, you've created a new prison, one with invisible bars made of judgment. Because spiritual superiority isn't just arrogance, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what awakening actually is. Awakening isn't about being better than others. It's about seeing your own conditioning, your own suffering, your own desperate clinging to identity. The person who looks at others and thinks they're still asleep has simply traded one form of sleep for another. They've moved from unconscious identification with success or status to unconscious identification with awakening itself. You can spot this trap by the feeling it produces. There's a subtle tightness in the chest when you're around people who seem unconscious. A quiet irritation, a sense of loneliness that tells itself it's enlightened solitude. You start conversations hoping to wake people up, and when they don't respond the way you expect, you feel disappointed, frustrated. You retreat into books and teachings, into communities of other seekers, and slowly, without realizing it, you've built walls. Not to protect your peace, but to protect your new identity. The person who knows, the person who sees. Merton warned about this relentlessly. He called it spiritual pride, and he watched it destroy more seekers than any external obstacle ever could. Because once you believe you're further along than others, you stop learning from them. You stop seeing the divine in their struggles. You stop recognizing that the irritating colleague, the materialistic relative, the person obsessed with trivial things, might be showing you exactly what you still haven't integrated. The spiritual ego is more dangerous than the worldly ego because it masquerades as humility. It uses the language of awakening to build monuments to itself. The second dangerous place follows closely behind the first. It's the place of endless preparation. The perpetual student. The seeker who never becomes a finder because finding would mean the search is over and the search has become their identity. This trap is subtle because it looks like dedication. You read more books, attend more retreats, study different traditions, learn meditation techniques, breathing practices, contemplative prayers. You listen to teachers from every lineage, collecting insights like precious stones. Your mind becomes a vast library of spiritual concepts. You can talk about non-duality and presence, about ego dissolution and transcendence. You know the theory. You understand the map. but you never quite arrive at the territory. There's always one more book to read, one more teacher to study, one more technique to master. And beneath this endless accumulation is a fear, the fear of actually being present with what is. Because all this knowledge, all this preparation, serves a hidden purpose. It keeps you safe from the rawness of direct experience. As long as you're preparing, you don't have to face the terrifying simplicity of just being. You don't have to sit with the silence that has nothing to say. You don't have to confront the possibility that everything you're seeking is already here, and all you're studying is just elaborate avoidance. Merton saw this pattern in the monastery. Monks who could recite scripture flawlessly but had never let a single word penetrate their hearts, who performed rituals with precision but had never once surrendered to what the ritual pointed toward. The mind loves complexity because complexity keeps it employed. The spiritual mind is no different. It will create elaborate systems of understanding, detailed maps of consciousness, sophisticated philosophies of awakening, all to avoid the unbearable simplicity of this moment, exactly as it is. You recognize this trap when you notice that your spiritual life is mostly conceptual, when your insights come from books rather than from sitting with your own pain, when you can describe awakening eloquently but struggle to simply be present with a crying child or a frustrated partner, when you feel more comfortable in spiritual discussions than in the messy, unenlightened chaos of ordinary life. The perpetual preparation is a kind of spiritual bypassing, but instead of bypassing emotions, you're bypassing existence itself. The third place is darker still, and fewer people talk about it. It's the place of spiritual despair. This comes later, usually after you've seen through the first two traps, or tried to. You've recognized your own spiritual pride and worked to dissolve it. You've stopped endlessly preparing and tried to simply be. And then, nothing happens. Or worse, you have glimpses, moments of clarity, of profound peace, of connection to something vast and loving. And then they fade. You return to your ordinary consciousness with all its anxiety and pettiness and confusion. And the contrast is unbearable. This is where many seekers get lost, because awakening becomes both the most real thing they've experienced and the most elusive. They've tasted something beyond the mind, and now the mind seems even more like a prison. They've felt what it's like to live without fear, and now every fear feels sharper, more painful. They've experienced moments of pure presence, and now their habitual distraction feels like betrayal. What was once ignorance becomes suffering, because now they know what's possible. They know what they're missing. Spiritual despair whispers, "You'll never get there. You've seen the promised land, but you'll die in the desert. Some people awaken, but you won't. You're too damaged, too neurotic, too fundamentally broken. Others can transcend their conditioning, but yours runs too deep. You've meditated for years and you're still anxious. You've studied with teachers and you're still selfish. You've had glimpses and they always fade. Give up. Stop torturing yourself with the impossible." Merton wrestled with this demon personally. In his journals, he wrote about the anguish of feeling both called to unity with God and separated from it by his own nature. He described periods of profound doubt where his whole spiritual life felt like self-deception, where prayer felt like talking to emptiness, where the monastery itself felt like an escape rather than a path. And what he discovered, slowly, painfully, was that this despair was itself a trap. Not because the feelings were invalid, but because they were based on a misunderstanding about what awakening actually is. The mind creates a fantasy of awakening as a permanent state of bliss and clarity, a final arrival where all struggle ceases. And when this fantasy doesn't materialize, despair rushes in to fill the gap. But awakening isn't the end of being human. It's not the replacement of your personality with some generic spiritual peace. It's the recognition of what's already here, beneath the struggle. And that recognition doesn't always feel like bliss. Sometimes it feels like heartbreak. Sometimes it feels like nothing at all. The despair comes from comparing your reality to an imagined ideal and finding it lacking. But the ideal was always false. The fourth dangerous place is one many never recognize as dangerous because it feels so good. It's the place of spiritual intensity, the addiction to peak experiences, to powerful emotions during meditation, to overwhelming love during prayer, to the rush of energy during certain practices. This isn't about discounting genuine spiritual experiences. Those are real and valuable. But there's a trap here, subtle and seductive. The trap of becoming dependent on these experiences, of measuring your spiritual progress by their intensity and frequency. You start chasing the highs, the deep meditations where you dissolve, the moments of divine love that bring tears, the energy sensations that confirm something is happening. And slowly your practice becomes about generating these experiences rather than about deepening your understanding. You try different techniques, looking for the ones that produce the strongest effects. You attend intense retreats, use specific breathing patterns, experiment with various spiritual technologies. And when the experiences come, you feel validated. When they don't, you feel like you're failing. Merton was particularly wary of this trap because he saw it everywhere in religious life. People who measured their prayer by the feelings it produced, who felt close to God only when experiencing consolation, who believed they were advancing when they felt spiritual passion and regressing when they felt dry. He called this spiritual consumerism, treating God like a commodity that should produce satisfying experiences. But the deepest truth, he insisted, is found not in the peaks but in the valleys, not in the intense experiences but in the willingness to show up even when nothing extraordinary happens. The addiction to intensity is dangerous because it keeps you focused on your own experience rather than on what's beyond experience. It makes you a collector of states rather than a dweller in truth. And perhaps most dangerously, it sets you up for inevitable disappointment because intensity cannot be sustained. The nervous system habituates. What once felt overwhelming becomes ordinary, and then you need stronger methods, more extreme practices, seeking ever greater heights to feel the same validation. You recognize this trap when your spiritual life becomes dramatic, when you need powerful experiences to feel connected, when ordinary practice feels insufficient, when you're always looking for the next retreat, the next technique, the next teacher, who might give you that experience again. The antidote isn't to reject genuine experiences, but to stop depending on them, to learn to value the quiet faithfulness of daily practice, to find God not in the earthquake or the fire, but in the still small voice that whispers only in silence. The fifth place is one that destroys from within, quietly, almost imperceptibly. It's the place of spiritual isolation, the withdrawal from ordinary life under the guise of protecting your peace. This seems wise at first. You've awakened to something real, something precious. And the world feels harsh, unconscious, driven by forces that disturb your newfound clarity. So you pull back. You limit your interactions. You avoid difficult people and challenging situations. You create a controlled environment where your peace won't be threatened. This can look like wisdom. Setting boundaries. Choosing your environment, protecting your energy. These are real and important practices. But there's a shadow side that's harder to see. Sometimes, what looks like protecting your peace is actually protecting your comfort. Sometimes withdrawal isn't about honoring your sensitivity, but about avoiding your growth. Because the people who trigger you, the situations that disturb your peace, are often showing you exactly what hasn't been integrated yet. They're revealing the edges of your awakening, the places where you're still attached, still reactive, still building identity. Merton lived in a monastery, so you might think he'd advocate for this kind of separation. But he didn't. Not exactly. He recognized that physical solitude could be necessary for certain souls at certain times, but he was fiercely critical of the kind of isolation that's really just escape. He wrote about monks who used the monastery to hide from life rather than to engage with it more deeply, who created a spiritual bubble where everything was controlled and predictable, and called it holiness. True spiritual practice, Merton insisted, prepares you for deeper engagement with the world, not escape from it. It gives you the capacity to remain centered in chaos, not the excuse to avoid chaos entirely. The person who can only maintain peace in perfect conditions hasn't really found peace. They've just found a comfortable hiding place. And the tragedy is, by hiding, they prevent themselves from discovering that peace isn't something that needs protection. Real peace isn't disturbed by disturbance. It doesn't flee from conflict. It doesn't require everyone around you to be calm and conscious. You know you're in this trap when your spiritual life makes you less engaged with the world, not more. When you avoid your family because they don't understand your path. When you retreat from challenges at work because they're not aligned with your awakening. When you stop participating in ordinary community because it feels too unconscious. When your sensitivity becomes an excuse for non-participation. The spiritual life isn't about building a perfect sanctuary. It's about discovering that you already are the sanctuary, and you can carry that with you anywhere. The sixth dangerous place is perhaps the most paradoxical. It's the place of seeking enlightenment as an escape from being human. This is subtle because it often appears as the most sincere spiritual aspiration. You want to transcend the ego, dissolve the self, realize your true nature beyond all identities and limitations. You read about enlightened beings who live in permanent peace, untouched by worldly concerns. And you want that. You want to be free from fear, from desire, from the endless cycle of wanting and suffering. But beneath this aspiration, there's sometimes a rejection, a subtle hatred of your humanity. You want to transcend because you can't accept. You want to dissolve the ego because you're ashamed of having one. You seek the infinite because the finite feels unbearable. Your spiritual practice becomes a way of saying no to your actual life, your actual body, your actual emotions. You meditate to escape anxiety, rather than to understand it. You pursue non-attachment to avoid the pain of attachment. You seek emptiness to flee from the fullness of your human experience. Merton saw this clearly because he struggled with it himself. He wrote about the temptation to use contemplation as an escape from the messy reality of being a person with needs, desires, and limitations. He observed how some monastics tried to become pure spirit, rejecting their bodies, their emotions, their very humanity as obstacles to holiness, and he recognized this as a profound mistake, because the point of awakening isn't to stop being human, it's to be fully human without the distortion of identification. It's to live as a person while knowing you're not only a person, to experience emotions without being controlled by them, to have preferences without suffering over them. The enlightenment that tries to escape humanity becomes another form of dissociation, another way of abandoning yourself. And ironically, it prevents real awakening, because awakening requires presence to what is, and you can't be present to what you're rejecting. You can't transcend what you won't include. The body isn't an obstacle to enlightenment. Your emotions aren't barriers to truth. Your human limitations aren't mistakes. They're the very ground where awakening happens. You recognize this trap when your spiritual practice makes you less embodied, not more. When you use meditation to escape difficult feelings rather than to be with them. When you talk about transcending desire, but haven't actually made peace with wanting things. When you aspire to be beyond attachment, but secretly judge people who love deeply. When enlightenment becomes a fantasy of being someone else, somewhere else, rather than being here, as you are, awake. The seventh and perhaps most devastating place is the one that comes after you've seen through all the others. It's the place of awakening without love, the clarity without compassion, the seeing without caring. This is the territory of those who have genuinely realized profound truths about the nature of reality, but somehow lost touch with their hearts in the process. They understand non-duality. They've experienced the emptiness of the self. They know directly that suffering comes from identification, and they use this knowledge as a shield against feeling. They look at people struggling and think, it's all an illusion anyway. They witness pain and say, there's no one there to suffer. They observe injustice and remain unmoved because it's all perfect as it is. They've attained a kind of philosophical immunity to the rawness of existence. And they mistake this immunity for wisdom. They mistake detachment for freedom. They mistake not caring for equanimity. Merton would have called this the most dangerous place of all, because it's where spiritual realization becomes inhuman, where truth becomes cold, where awakening becomes a form of death rather than a fuller life. He knew that any awakening that doesn't break your heart open isn't complete. Any realization that doesn't make you more tender, more vulnerable, more capable of love, has missed something essential. The deepest truth isn't just that everything is empty. It's that everything is empty and therefore precious. That nothing lasts and therefore every moment matters. That there's no separate self and therefore every being is yourself. True awakening doesn't make you indifferent to suffering. It makes you more sensitive to it, not less. Because when you see through the illusion of separation, you don't stop caring about the person in pain. You recognize them as yourself. Their suffering becomes your suffering, not because you're identified with it, but because the walls between you and them have dissolved. The person who uses their spiritual realization to justify coldness, to avoid the vulnerability of caring, to protect themselves from the heartbreak of being alive in a world full of pain, has found clarity but lost something more important. They've lost their humanity. And in losing that, they've lost the very thing that makes awakening worth anything. You recognize this trap when your spirituality makes you less moved by suffering, not more. When you use concepts like, it's all perfect, to avoid responding to injustice. When you feel superior to people who still care deeply about worldly concerns. When your non-attachment looks like disconnection. When your equanimity feels like numbness. The antidote isn't to abandon your insights. It's to let them break you open rather than close you down. To let the truth of emptiness reveal the preciousness of form. To let the recognition of no self deepen your capacity to love all selves. So here we are, having walked through 7 territories of consciousness that destroy those who awaken. The irony is that each one appears to be part of the path. Spiritual superiority feels like awareness. Endless preparation feels like dedication. Spiritual despair feels like honesty. The addiction to intensity feels like passion. Spiritual isolation feels like wisdom. Seeking enlightenment as escape feels like aspiration. And awakening without love feels like realization. But Merton understood something crucial. The real path isn't about avoiding these places. It's about walking through them with eyes open, recognizing them not as enemies but as teachers. Each trap reveals something about how the mind tries to protect itself, even in the process of awakening. Each dangerous place shows you where you're still grasping, still building identity, still running from what is. The person who awakens isn't the person who never enters these traps. It's the person who enters them, recognizes them, and learns to walk differently. Who feels the pull of spiritual superiority and chooses humility anyway. Who notices the comfort of endless preparation and risks direct experience anyway. Who sits with spiritual despair without believing its story. Who enjoys powerful experiences without depending on them. Who maintains engagement with life even when withdrawal seems easier. Who embraces their humanity while knowing they're more than human. Who lets their realization deepen their capacity for love rather than replace it. This is the narrow path Merton spoke about. Not narrow because it's exclusive, but narrow because it requires such careful attention, such constant vigilance, such willingness to be wrong about what you thought awakening was. The mind is incredibly sophisticated in its ability to corrupt even the purest intentions. It can take any spiritual insight and turn it into a new cage, any liberation and make it into a new bondage, any awakening and put it to sleep again. But there's a way through, and it's simpler than any of the traps. It's the willingness to be exactly where you are, exactly as you are, without needing it to be different, without needing to be further along, without needing to be awakened or unawakened, without needing to transcend or improve or perfect anything. Just this, just now. Just the willingness to be present to what is, including all your confusion, all your seeking, all your attempts to get somewhere else. Because here's what Merton discovered in his years of silence. Awakening isn't something you achieve. It's something you stop preventing. It's not a destination you reach, but a relaxation into what's already here. And all these dangerous places, all these traps and pitfalls, they're just variations of the same basic movement, trying to be somewhere else, someone else, something else than what you are right now. The spiritual life, the real one, isn't about ascending to some higher state. It's about descending into the depth of this moment. It's about sinking so fully into what is that there's no energy left for resistance, for judgment, for the endless commentary about whether this is good enough. It's about being so completely here that here reveals itself as nowhere and everywhere at once. So completely yourself that yourself dissolves into everything, and that's when something extraordinary happens. Not extraordinary in the sense of dramatic or intense, but extraordinary in the sense of ordinary made luminous. The cup of water becomes infinite. The breath becomes prayer. The person in front of you becomes God, not metaphorically, not as a spiritual concept, but as direct recognition, as the only truth there ever was, hiding in plain sight, waiting patiently for you to stop seeking and simply see. This is what Merton meant by contemplation, not a technique or a practice, though those can help, but a quality of presence. A way of meeting reality without the filter of need, without the agenda of becoming, without the violence of preference, just allowing what is to be what it is, and discovering in that, allowing a kind of love that doesn't depend on anything being different. The dangerous places remain dangerous only as long as you don't see them. Once you recognize them, they become allies. They show you where you're still trying to manipulate your experience, still trying to make yourself into someone worth being. And in that recognition, something relaxes. The seeking softens, the striving dissolves, and what remains is so simple, so obvious, so completely ordinary that most people miss it entirely. You're already awake. You always have been. The seeking was never necessary. The practices, the insights, the struggles, the triumphs, they were all happening in a dream. Not your dream because there's no you separate from it. Just dream. Just this inexplicable appearance of existence, knowing itself through every form, every perspective, every moment of confusion and clarity. And you, whoever you think you are, reading these words, trying to understand, trying to get somewhere, trying to be better, more aware, more enlightened, you're already it. Already home. Already complete. The trying is what creates the distance. The effort is what sustains the illusion of separation. But don't believe these words, don't make them into another concept to carry. Let them be nothing. Let them point to nothing. And in that nothing, maybe, if you're very still, very quiet, very willing to not know anything at all, you might notice what's always been here. What can never be lost because it was never found. What you can never reach because you never left. This is the teaching Merton whispered across decades of silence. This is what he learned watching his own mind destroy itself and rebuild itself 1,000 times. This is what he discovered in the depth of night, in the darkness of doubt, in the light of ordinary days. That the whole spiritual journey is a circle that returns you to exactly where you started, but with eyes that can finally see. The dangerous places don't disappear. The traps remain. But they lose their power when you stop believing you need to escape them. When you realize that even the trap is grace, even the struggle is awakening, even the feeling of being lost is just another way consciousness experiences itself. So walk carefully, yes. Be aware of where the mind tries to corrupt your seeking, but walk joyfully too, because there's nowhere to get to, no one to become, nothing to achieve. You're already standing at the destination, disguised as someone who's still searching. And that disguise, that beautiful, terrible, necessary disguise, is part of the perfection of what is. In the end, awakening is just the willingness to be destroyed by these dangerous places. To let them burn away everything you thought you knew, everything you thought you were, until all that remains is this inexplicable presence, this nameless awareness, this love without object or reason, simply being itself as everything, as nothing. As the ordinary miracle of another breath, another moment, another chance to recognize what was never hidden. That's what Merton discovered. That's what he offers to anyone willing to walk this perilous, beautiful, ultimately unnecessary path. The invitation to stop seeking and simply be, to stop becoming and simply rest, to stop trying to awaken and recognize you never slept. The 7 dangerous places that destroy those who awaken. They only destroy who you think you are. And that, my friend, might be the greatest gift of all.